Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon if you're in a different time zone. I am Diana Fox Carney. I'm delighted to be here to moderate this conversation around the future of transport today, based on the Corporate Knights Earth Index. And we're delighted to have you with us today. Thank you for being here. We're also very grateful to Schneider Electric for enabling these roundtables around the Earth Index. And we're looking forward to a conversation where you pose your questions and our panelists do their best to answer them. So please do put your questions in the chat as we go along. So before we start today, I would, as usual, like to make a land acknowledgement and to say that Corporate Knights honors the peoples and land of all First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples and their valuable past and present contributions to this land. And with that, I will get us going. Many of you will know that this is the third in this series. We started with an overview of the Earth Index, and Ralph Torrie, who's with us today, presented his findings. And the aim of this Earth Index is really to keep governments' feet to the fire around the commitments they've made. It is the say-do gap, as Ralph calls it, and he's really tried to make granular the analysis around that and show that sectorally. So we started with an overview. 2 weeks ago, we looked at the power system, electricity generation. Today, we're going to look at transport. And in 2 weeks' time, we're going to look at the building piece, which is all of these we've discussed before at Corporate Knights. All of these are critical pieces. I'm really excited about the transport piece today. So the format will be that Ralph is going to give a brief presentation and then we'll have discussion. So I'll introduce the panelists after Ralph's presentation. But now I will hand over to Ralph, who is the Director of Research at Corporate Knights and who provides us with all the great data on which we can base our discussions today. Thank you, Ralph.
Welcome to the second of our 3 sector-focused web panels looking at the performance of the G20 members in responding to the climate emergency. Today we'll be focusing on the transportation sector and the challenges that come with reducing emissions there, particularly from personal mobility. The Earth Index, just by way of context, is a project that Corporate Knights has launched, multi-year project, which will be tracking how the members of the G20 are doing in reducing their emissions as compared with the targets that they have set for themselves. The G20 includes 43 countries. It's responsible for 80% of the world's GDP, 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and over 90% of market capitalization of listed companies. As you can see in the bottom right of this slide, we break it into 2 groups, those that are high-income countries under the World Bank definition. So we have USA, Canada, European Union, Japan, and so on, with average per capita GDP in 2019 of $42,900 US on a purchase power parity basis, and 1.2 billion people altogether living in those countries. In contrast, in the right-hand column, you can see the middle income members of G20 representing 3 times as many people at 3.6 billion, but only a fraction of the per capita GDP at an average of $6,600 US per person. Here, of course, we have China, India, Indonesia, all of the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, and so on. And that rounds out the scope of the universe of countries that we include in this exercise. At the center of the Earth Index analysis is a simple calculation where we look at the actual emission reductions achieved in the most recent year that we have data for. So this year we looked at the 2019 numbers just before the pandemic hit, and we compare the emission reductions or increases, as the case may be, that occurred in that year in each country with the level of emission reductions that would be required to be on track for hitting the country's own stated commitments for emission reductions by 2030 and or for net zero emissions later in the century. So we call this the say-do gap because it compares what the countries themselves had said they're going to do with what they're actually achieving. In the case of the high-income countries, as you can see here on the left-hand side, a score of 60% overall indicates that while emissions came down in 2019, they only came down by 60% of the rate that they would have to be declining in order to be on track for hitting 2030 commitments. In contrast with the middle-income countries, emissions actually went up. That's what the negative score reflects. And they went up by nearly as much as they would have to be coming down if those countries were to be on track for meeting their commitments to net zero emissions later in the century, or for those that have targets in 2030 for their 2030 targets. We do this sector by sector, country by country. In this next slide, you can see the results for the transport sector for the two groups, the high income group on the left and the middle income group on the right. The blue bar represents actual emissions in 2019. And the yellow bar in the case of the high income group and the red bar in the case of the middle income group represents the sector Earth Index score for transportation in each case. And as you can see, a little bit of progress in the high income countries. So emissions did come down, but they would have to be coming down 8 times faster for them to be on course to meet their own commitments for 2030. When it comes to the middle income countries, emissions are going up fairly dramatically. In fact, they're going up faster than they would have to be coming down for those countries to be on track to meet their stated commitments. Interesting also to note in this slide that even though there are 3 times more people in the middle income group than there are in the high income group, the total emissions in the high income countries like Canada and the United States and Europe are still higher than the aggregate greenhouse gas emissions from transportation in the middle income countries. You can see this to a certain extent in this next slide, which shows the actual emissions in gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents for transportation and for total emissions. For China, first of all, is the first group of bars. Each group of 3 shows the emissions in 1990, 2005, and 2019. So you can see what's been happening over that period of time and the dramatic increase in overall emissions in China. The red bar represents the portion of those emissions that are coming from the transportation sector. So in the middle income countries, China, India, and the rest of that group, we have emissions growing quite dramatically in the case of China and India, but strongly in all of the middle income countries over this period, particularly since 2005, with emissions from the transportation sector also growing. Even so, the contribution that transportation emissions make to total greenhouse gas emissions in the middle income countries is still down around 10%, a little lower or a little more, depending on the individual country, much lower than the contribution that transportation emissions make in the high-income countries, which are shown in the groups on the right-hand side of this chart: Canada, United States, European Union, and the others, Japan and Australia, and so on. And a couple of things here. You know, first of all, that transportation, as I mentioned, is making up a much greater share, as much as 25% or more in the case of the United States and Canada, the highest contribution anywhere. Also, you can see that transportation emissions have not been growing too much in these countries, even declining a little bit in the United States and the European Union. And overall emissions also since 2005 have been declining in almost all of the high-income countries. In Canada, not so much. Emissions are pretty much where they were in 2005 in the year 2019. But transportation emissions really not starting to come down the way that they will need to hit 2030 targets. The differences in these emissions are reflected in the very different per capita levels of greenhouse gas emissions between the high and middle income countries. This chart shows energy use per person It's a logarithmic scale on the y-axis, which is necessary to get everything on the same chart while still showing the trend lines in the middle income countries. And as you can see, the growth in the emissions from those middle income countries, but nevertheless, by 2019, they're still well below 1 gigajoule per capita. This is energy use in transportation. The pattern for emissions is virtually identical. So below 1 gigajoule per ton, down around 0.7 gigajoules per ton in China, much lower in India, compared to Canada and the United States, which are the most transportation, energy, and emissions intensive countries in the world, with Canada coming in just under 6 and the United States at about 6.5 tons per capita. So nearly 10 times higher than the levels in the middle income countries, and even more so when compared to India. The European Union performs quite a bit better than North America in terms of per capita transportation emissions, coming in at around 2 gigajoules per person, but still a big gulf between the energy that's being used in the high income countries for transportation and the energy that's being used in the middle income countries, which even with the growth rates that we're seeing in the middle income countries will take a long time to close unless we see dramatic reductions in the per capita emissions from those high income countries, which we need to see if we're going to hit our targets. And electrification will play a big role in reducing the energy consumption for transportation in those countries. Here we see part of the explanation for those gaps in per capita energy use levels in the middle income countries. What we're looking at here is the population of motor vehicles in millions in those groups of countries. So China, India, and the other middle income countries on the left, and Canada, the United States, and the EU, and the other high income countries on the right. The green portion represents motorcycles and scooters and three-wheeled vehicles, and the blue represents the cars and the light trucks and the SUVs and so on. And so you can see that there's quite a different pattern in the middle income countries. In India, for example, scooters and motorcycles outnumber cars 3 to 1. And there are similar patterns throughout Asia, in particular with respect to this metric. China, it's more evenly balanced, but nevertheless, much higher portions of the vehicle population in the middle income countries made up of these highly efficient, lightweight vehicles, motorized vehicles, as compared to the high income countries where notwithstanding the popularity of motorcycles and scooters in some European countries, it still represents a much smaller contribution to the vehicle population than automobiles and light trucks and SUVs and so on. The automobile system, the emissions that come out of this system really depend on a number of factors: how many trips we're making, how long they are, what's the mode choice? Are we taking a car or are we taking transit? How many people per vehicle basically are there? What is the fuel efficiency of the vehicle? We just were talking about the big difference between motorcycles and cars in that regard. And then of course, finally, what is the carbon intensity of the fuel of those vehicles? Any of these 5 factors can and does affect the overall greenhouse gas emissions from personal transportation, which is what I'm focused on here. There is a 6th factor, which is the emissions embedded in the vehicle, the fuel, and the infrastructure itself. These have been relatively small historically, but as tailpipe emissions decline and eventually drop to 0, the embedded emissions will become relatively more important. This is a system which is ripe for disruption. Keep in mind that mobility is not actually valued for its own sake, but for the contribution that it makes to providing access to what is valued, whether that's a job or a recreational experience or shopping or whatever. It's what's at the end of the trip, the destination, that gives value to mobility, not the actual mobility itself. What this means is that there's a lot of ways that we can bring down greenhouse gas emissions besides changing to electricity. A more compact and interconnected urban form, the telepresence, telecommuting, teleworking technologies, and telecommunication technologies as substitutes for mobility, better infrastructure for transit and active transportation, mobility as a service business models, which are reducing the number of vehicles and the amount of vehicle travel that's necessary to provide the mobility, the optimization of logistics. All of these things can compete with and determine the level and the pattern of motorized mobility that's going to be required to provide access. But it's access that drives the system. And most trips, by the way, are local. They start and end at home on the same day. That's what I mean by a local trip. But what happened when the car came along is that what constituted local changed. The car increases a person's local domain by a factor of 500 compared to what it had been basically throughout history. And that changed everything. And trucks have a similar impact on supply chains. The impacts have occurred over a period of 100 years, and they've transformed civilization, but the system is now sagging under its own weight. It's impossible that it could be fully realized in the megacities of the global south, and it's failing everywhere to deliver on its central promise of affordable, fast, and convenient access. It's a disruptive system that is now itself ripe for disruption. Why we're focused on electrification when there are all of these other factors that can contribute to the decarbonization of the sector? Electrification is not going to address many of the dimensions of unsustainability of the automobile system. But there's a climate emergency, and that requires that greenhouse gas emissions from motorized personal mobility come down quickly. And of all the available levers in this complex system for doing that, it's the electrification of vehicles that holds the most promise for deep, quick, and permanent decarbonization of transportation in the 2020s, in this next critical decade. Yes, we must simultaneously pull hard on all of those other levers for better transit, better urban forms, more advanced telepresent technologies, and so on. But and these things will facilitate actually the emergency push for electrification. And more importantly, they will provide the basis for the longer term transition to sustainable urban transportation. You can see here in Canada, we're spending $250 billion a year to support this automobile system. When we're in our cars, which is only about 5% or less of the time, they're parked the rest of the time, we're achieving speeds on average of about 40 kilometers per hour. But if you add in all the time we spend earning the money to support this system, to come up with that $250 billion a year, over 10% of our economy, then the average speed drops to just over 20 kilometers an hour. And it's declining slowly as the cost of the infrastructure continues to go up, and more recently as the cost of fuel has started to increase rather rapidly as a result of the inherent instability and fragility of the geopolitical fossil fuel industry. I want to, continuing with this focus on Canada, just harken back a couple of years ago to the Build Back Better strategy corporate knights put forward for what a post-pandemic green recovery could look like or might have looked like, where we felt about 2% of GDP incremental would be necessary throughout the 2020s and increased investment to put the country on a track to a low carbon future. This is consistent with what more recent estimates from McKinsey, RBC, the IEA, and others have concluded. Vehicle electrification is always a significant component of such strategies. In our case, we had figured somewhere in the range of $16 to $18 billion a year throughout the 2020s of incremental investment would put us on track to an electrified and sustainable transportation future. That hasn't, and it's not happening in Canada. We've lost some valuable time. 2030 gets closer and closer, and we still seem to be stalled in terms of mounting the type of emergency response that's required to respond effectively to the climate crisis. There is some good news, as is reflected in this next slide, which shows what happened to electric vehicle sales. Even during the pandemic, they were growing. In fact, they grew faster than ever in 2021. The growth is concentrated in Europe and Asia. North America is not keeping up with the pace that's being set in these other regions of the G20. But accelerated growth, nevertheless, you can see is happening even in the Americas, as represented by the sort of lime green middle portion of these bars showing electrical vehicle sales going back to 2010. Canada ought to be able to and needs to be able to exploit the opportunities that this represents both domestically and internationally for our economy. We're already market leaders in off-road electric vehicles, school buses, municipal vehicles, and so on. Our proximity to the US market is a great advantage in that regard. And when it comes to the batteries that will be necessary, we're one of the few countries that has all of the ingredients to be a leader in the provision of the batteries that will be necessary for the decarbonization of the transportation sector. We have the minerals, we have the supply chain ecosystem, we have the low carbon electricity and the support of government policies. And more important, relatively speaking, we're in a position to provide the type of reliable supply that the manufacturers of electric vehicles will be looking for in the sourcing of the minerals that go into their batteries. This chart elaborates on this point. You can see the extent to which growth in the demand for copper and nickel and lithium will result from the transition to vehicle electrification. The energy market will come to represent eventually 50% or more of all the copper and nickel consumption and 20 to 40% of the rare earths. It's going to dominate the markets totally for lithium and cobalt. So this is another big opportunity for Canada, as I was saying. We ought to be able to become the supplier of choice for manufacturers that are seeking reliable, secure, ethically and sustainable source mineral inputs for the vehicles the batteries that are going into their vehicles. I just want to end with a few what I call faint signals and wild cards, just some points to stimulate the discussion with our experts that we'll have now. Number one, the future of public transit is a big question mark right now. It's at a crossroads. Pouring more money at the same model that dates back to the 1950s for how we provide public transit may not be the right approach. I think we need to be looking at a contribution from public transit that combines digital technologies, modern optimization software techniques, electrification of the vehicles, and so on, to bring a type of public transit forward that can compete with the automobile, including door-to-door service and convenience that will rival that of the automobile. The autonomous vehicle is another wild card in this mix. Even if it only gets implemented on limited access highways, it will be disruptive. It's just not clear whether it'll be good or bad disruption. It could facilitate super sprawl because people might be willing to put up with a longer commute if they were able to basically go back to sleep after getting into their car in the morning. But it could also reduce travel costs and congestion in cities, depending on how it's developed and how it's regulated and how the technological feasibility of autonomous vehicles in urban environment plays out over time. Have we reached peak car? Another question. We know that car ownership is lower in the younger generation than it was in the older generations. If mobility as a service and alternative modes such as electric bikes and other modes continue to grow at the pace that we've been witnessing over the last 2 or 3 years, we could see a rather rapid decline in the relative importance of the private automobile in the delivery of mobility in the high income countries. The introduction on the other side of that coin, the introduction of electric pickup trucks, which is imminent now. Will this herald a wave of EV growth in the heavier vehicle sector that is going to be necessary to bend the curve? We'll have to wait and see, but that's definitely one of the wild cards in this mix. I think that the use of EV batteries for their electrical storage capability is another wild card in the thinking about this future system. There are going to be millions, eventually tens and even hundreds of millions of portable batteries that hold many times the energy that they need for most days' vehicle use. And we'll have enough spare capacity to provide several days of typical residential electricity consumption. So this could, if you think about it, this could really transform grids and the whole way that electricity and where electricity is bought and sold and used. Mobility as a service, I've already made reference to. I think it could play a role with other business and technology innovations in making mobility more affordable. The automobile, as we've seen, is getting more expensive, not less expensive. And the emerging models for how mobility can be provided in urban environments could have the potential to dramatically reduce the overall cost. Finally, and this is probably the most important question as we head into this next critical decade, or proceed with this critical decade that's already in its second year, how can we accelerate the uptake of electric vehicles? What is the appropriate role of government incentives versus regulatory measures and the banning of combustion of vehicles? If charging speed is a barrier for long distance trips, how can that be addressed? Is battery swapping, for example, an option that needs to be encouraged and developed? There's lots of questions to address, and I look forward to the discussion with our experts this morning, who are both from Europe, where much greater and quicker progress is being made in the transition to electric vehicles. And one of the things that we're trying to do with the Earth Index project is identify where successes are being achieved, in which sectors, in which countries, and then hold those examples up and encourage the dissemination of those stories in the hope that that will accelerate their replication to other countries in parts of the world like Canada, where the transition to vehicle electrification is simply not proceeding at the pace that it needs to be if we are going to successfully address the climate emergency in the 2020s, as we must. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it back to Diana to lead our expert discussion.
I now want to bring in the other panelists, and we have today with us Christina Boo, and Christina is head of the Norwegian EV Association, and she's been there since 2014. So she's really seen the rise of EVs in Norway, where there is an 80% market share, I believe. And as we know, Norway is the kind of poster child for success in EVs. So really interested to hear about that experience. We also have Mike Doucleff, and he's head of the Electric Mobility Division at Schneider Electric, and he's joining us from France today. And he can tell us about kind of what lies behind the EVs that we see, that we drive. He helps us get them out there in different ways, so we can talk about that. And we'll also bring Ralph in, of course, into the discussion. So I think Ralph talked about some of the really key issues here, and it's the energy use of vehicles. There are other environmental considerations around the way we structure our transit systems at the moment, and there are also these issues of equity and particularly a concern that poorer groups won't be able to afford EVs, won't have access to them, and how we deal with that. Although, I think the really encouraging news that I read this morning is how important the electrification of two-wheel vehicles is, particularly in Asia, and how that is actually accounting for over 60% of the savings in fossil fuel liquid fuels has come from electrification of two-wheel vehicles, which of course are reaching poorer groups. Anyway, we have all these issues on the table, but the big question relating to this index is, how do we accelerate? How do we get from where we are now to match the commitments that have been made around transit? So I'm just going to start with Christina and just ask us if you can give us a couple of top line views on what you think the key issues are for accelerating this transition to electrical vehicles right now, given the supply chain issues that we're facing, I think we have to be cognizant of that. And then we'll get into those specific issues. Thank you, Christina, and welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a very simple and short answer to your question, and that's just political will. Norwegians are not more environmentally friendly than Canadians. We are not much different. Norway is the size of Germany. It's cold temperatures, long distances, rugged mountains. It's probably the least likely place to succeed when it comes to EVs. So if we can do it, anyone can do it. And we did it really fast. And that's, I think, the most important sort of message from Norway is that we moved from a market share of 3% in 2012, 10 years ago, and we're now at above 80. I'm talking fully electric cars here, not including plug-in hybrids, because we are steering towards zero-emission vehicles that can run 100% on renewable energy. So to do that in 10 years, it's possible to do it quickly, but we need political will and political will to use political measures to make it happen. And that's all that has happened in Norway. It's as simple as that.
Well, that is fantastic that you could distill it to such simplicity. Let's ask Mike the same question.
Well, I think, Christina's right in terms of having the political support. We've seen that in Norway. We've also seen that in China, of course, China doing amazing things, 400,000 electric buses, electrifying fleets of taxis in cities at the same time. But I think the other angle that's coming very soon is really the acquisition price of the EVs themselves. And we've seen the battery lithium-ion price declining by 90% over the last years. And if you follow the cost curve, when the price of the lithium-ion battery gets to $100 per kilowatt hour, it means directionally OEMs can offer the upfront purchase price of passenger vehicles. And here I'm talking about mass market vehicles. I'm not talking about premium sector. Mass market vehicles at the same cost for internal combustion engine vehicles. So then imagine the future, and that future is not too far away. That future is in this decade, even maybe a few years away, where you walk into a dealership or you go online and you look left and you see the classic diesel engine that you know very well, but you look right and you see the EV, which is fun to drive. It's at the same price or it's cheaper. And by the way, it's 10 times cheaper to operate, right? It's 10 times cheaper to use electrons versus molecules. There's virtually no maintenance, and EVs last around 3 times as long. So I think ultimately it's going to be the economics that come and take over. Now, where we can rely even more so, to Christina's point, from the political point of view, is how and where we deploy, charging infrastructure. And today we've been very focused on having fast charging networks along the highway, which is necessary and it's needed. But if you take, for example, the average, kilometers driven in Europe, and here it's an average, right? It's between 1,500 to 1,600 kilometers per month, which is not a lot if you imagine a vehicle of the future having a 500 to 600 kilometer range. So what this means is that the charging habits, in the future are going to be not so much always in public or on the highway, but much more at homes and much more in buildings. And the reason for that is, first of all, the range allows for it. If you drive 1,500 kilometers a month and your range is 500 kilometers, you don't need to charge every day. The second point is coming down to the cost itself. It's 20 to 50% cheaper to charge at home or with a connection to a building versus out in public. And that's really driven by many factors in terms of the cost of the infrastructure. It can be in terms of the time of use, demand surcharges, but integration to renewables and on-site storage ultimately bring that cost down to 20 to 50%. And finally is the convenience factor. At the end of the day, it's more convenient to charge when you stop versus stopping to charge.
That's fantastic. I think the two of you have given us a really good overview, and it raises a number of questions for me. The issue of cost has always been paramount, and obviously as humans we're not that rational, and so the upfront cost is clearly what we think about, even if the long tail is much cheaper. Two issues on cost. Right now, as you mentioned, battery pack price has been declining a lot. It's my understanding is it's gone up recently a little bit, and there is this competition for the critical minerals. it's not clear that the decline is going to continue at the same level, let's put it that way, given the constraints on mineral production. So that's one question. Where do we expect that price, upfront price advantage to be there in the time frame that was conjectured? And the second question, which Christina maybe is one for you. In various jurisdictions around the world, in most jurisdictions, the price of electricity has risen recently. In Europe, I'm from the UK originally, the price of electricity has gone through the roof, right? So how is that affecting the calculation of the running cost side of the electric vehicles? And this obviously links back to our discussion around electric power generation last time, but it would be interesting just to think a little bit about those two parameters of the cost side and whether we think those are going to change relative to what we might have thought a year ago, basically. So who wants to start? Shall I just, maybe Mike, if you can come in on that, where you think the battery packs are going to go?
Well, I think, of course, the recent, and when I say recent, going back 18 months to years, even the coming, we've had big stress on supply chains, big, raw material inflation in general. So I think the environment we're in today is quite a specific environment, and that's not going to, obviously be here long term. So it's not really a question of if, it's more a question of when, and maybe there's going to be a slight bump in the road because of this current environment, but over time, we still believe if you follow the cost curve down, it's going to come. So I think it's more a matter of, is it going to be delaying a bit? And you see now, even EV suppliers are having 1-year lead times more or less to deliver vehicles. You're seeing that heavily in North America, which is impacting adoption. So I think it's more a question of, is this going to delay it a bit versus actually change the macroeconomics?
Okay, that's good to know. And what about the running cost, Christina?
Well, the luck is that the price of petrol and diesel is up too, at least here in Norway.
That's true. That's true.
So yeah, so it hasn't really changed that much. Of course, Norway has been quite lucky with low electricity prices. We have more or less 100% renewable electricity production in Norway, hydropower mostly, and quite lucky in that sense. But with the current crisis in Europe and everything, it's come up a lot. So it's been heavily debated, but it's still a lot cheaper to run an electric car. And yeah, as I said, petrol and diesel is up again as well. If I have time, I saw a comment in the chat about my point saying that if Norway can do it, anyone can do it. And someone commented that it's easier for Norway because Norway is a rich country. I've actually named that argument the Norway's rich argument, because it's very often used, and I get that question a lot from journalists as well. And it's a bit of a misunderstanding, because what Norway does, which most other countries do not do, is taxing the sales of new cars that pollutes heavily. So we have very high purchase taxes on new car sales, and VAT 25% on top of that. So buying a new car that pollutes is very expensive in Norway, but EVs, full electric cars, are not taxed. So what we really do, and that's also when this equity question comes in, what we really do is we have rich people making the bad choice pay for people who makes a good choice to be able to buy, to incentivize EVs. Because who buys new cars? Poor people do not buy new cars. Most people in Norway buy a second-hand car, 8 out of 10 actually every year. So most people don't buy a new car, and half of the ones who buy a new car, they are companies. So, but still we have to use policies to make those who buy a new car make the right choice. And that is a lot more fair for the general population than taxing fuels a lot more. Because if you're a single mother driving a diesel car and that's what you have, it's not nice if the prices of diesel rise very much. But we need to make sure that those who every day take the choice of buying a new car make the right choice. And then gradually, these vehicles will be available in the second-hand market, which we now see in Norway with pretty high sales for a few years. We have a second-hand market, so it's definitely not just rich people driving EVs anymore. It's just regular people. But of course, they are there in the secondhand market coming gradually. And at the moment we are, so the share on the road is only at about 17%. So 17% of all passenger cars in Norway are now fully electric nationally. But in Oslo, Bergen, the two biggest cities, we are at one third, or more or less. So 1/3 of the cars is, and this is the most important point, is we cannot continue selling new cars that cannot run on renewables. Why do we do that? Why don't we use political measures to stop that? Because it takes a long time to change a vehicle fleet. We only change a few cars every year. So we have to stop selling new cars that cannot renewables, and we have to stop buying those cars and selling those cars. And that for Norway, the limit is 2025. So in a little bit less than 3 years from now, our goal is not selling new cars that aren't full electric or zero emission from 2025. That's the goal. And that's what more countries should do. Start using policies and have goals to stop selling new cars that cannot run on renewables.
So in Canada, we have that 10 years after you. So we have 2035. So we've got you've mentioned two big policy measures. One is this sort of ban on sales of new cars. But as you say, it takes a long time to filter through to what actually runs on the road. And the second is changing the price structure so that there's a heavy incentive to buy a renewable, an electric vehicle. Ralph, can you come in with any thoughts of other really important policy measures that you would like to see in this space to accelerate the transition?
A couple of things. On the front end cost issue, whenever I hear that raised as a barrier, what it's really telling me is that we are not really in emergency response mode, first of all. And secondly, that we're not getting out of the box that we've been in on the way that vehicles are financed. We do expensive things all the time. If front-end costs were an insurmountable barrier, we wouldn't have nuclear power plants. We wouldn't have highways. We wouldn't have bridges. We wouldn't have all kinds of multi-billion-dollar projects that somehow seem to get financed and built without going to the consumer to pay for them in advance. We've got to, given the nature of the climate emergency, come up, and I think this is a failure of the business and finance sector as much as it is of government. There's just been such a dearth of innovation in how we can deal with this front-end cost problem in the way that we've dealt with so many other front-end cost problems and get it smoothed out over the life of the asset in a way that takes this burden off the individual consumer and gets the financing into the hands of people who are professionals at doing that sort of thing. It boggles my mind that this continues to come up as a reason why we're stalled on the implementation, not only of electric vehicles, but home retrofits as well. I think that I mean, it's good. I agree with Christina. We have to we have to have that ban. 2035 is better than not having it. But as she pointed out, that means we'll be still using fossil fuel cars in 2050, given how long they last. So in general, we really need to accelerate. And we need to get into an emergency response mode. We're not asking the questions that we asked when COVID came along, where the first question was not, is it cost effective? The first question was, what do we have to do to address this emergency?
Yeah, Diana, and if I may just to complement that, Diana, if you don't mind, I mean, and I think there is definitely a place, as Christina said, on the public side, but also in the private side. So probably most of the people on the call today, it's time for the big corporates as well to step up. If I just take our company, for example, we have a fleet of 15,000 vehicles worldwide, which we've committed to electrify by latest 2030 with 1/3 in 2025. And we're doing that by incentive. We're incentivizing our employees. Just as Christina did at the public level, we're saying you're going to get a higher allowance if you buy an electric car. We're going to pay for your electricity. We're going to pay for your charger, your installation, if you buy an EV. And if you want to buy a gas car, fine, but you're going to pay for that yourself. So I think that there's a role for the corporates to play in this as well, not only the government policy, but also those corporate commitments that we've all been taking.
And you're absolutely right that, you know, employee commuting is a key segment in the GHG protocol of scope 3 emissions for companies. So any company who has a net zero commitment, that's a kind of low hanging fruit. And I think the point that's really clear is we know what we need to do in this space and how we accelerate it. So that's an easier problem than, for example, in agriculture and land use, for example, where we, relatively speaking, don't know what the solutions are. But, you know, it's very evident that right now in Ontario, where I am, I was hearing on the radio yesterday that it's taking between a year and 2 years to get an EV. So assuming everyone on this conversation rushes out to their car dealership today, they won't be driving that car certainly till 2023. And that is a real problem. So any thoughts, and you know, it's a big issue because that's a question not only of batteries, but microchips, other things, competition between different jurisdictions. But how do we keep people encouraged about this transition if we're not actually able to supply the vehicles? Anyone can jump in on that one. This is a sort of mind boggler to me. So, you know, what is the solution here? I should say that one of the points that is made with respect to Ontario is because there are not the same regulations in Ontario such that dealerships are not obliged to sell EVs, whereas in some provinces in Canada, they have to equalize or they have to sell a proportion of EVs for every gas vehicle. So apparently lots of the vehicles are not coming here because the dealerships have not traditionally had an incentive to sell them. I hope that would now change, but there still does seem to be an absolute shortage of electric vehicles at the moment. Is that what you're seeing in Norway, Christina, or not?
Well, we have been a very lucky country for a few years because of the policies in Norway. A lot of EVs have come here, and we are probably the country in the world with the widest range of different models. I think we had more than probably say 70 or 80 different models, full electric models sold last year. And we also currently have a lot of we never had Chinese cars in Europe really, but now they're entering and a lot of them are coming to Norway first. So we have several new OEMs, Chinese OEMs establishing themselves in Norway at the moment. But yes, we have that problem as well, especially the Volkswagen AG brands and so on. Long delays. The Skoda Enyaq, for example, I hear about people waiting on their second year now, but there are other models you can get. But I think this is a bit of a perfect storm when it comes to car deliveries at the moment. First, you had the chip problem after the pandemic, and then the crisis in Ukraine, etc. So I think that it will help, but also the demand is growing. So what we see is, of course, that the OEMs do they prioritize the markets where it's most interesting to come. Again, back to policies. And I was saying a bit about what Norway is doing, and I very much understand that not all countries can do what Norway is doing. Politically, it's very difficult to suddenly implement the high tax levels that we have. But to talk a little bit about what can be done, and which more and more countries are doing, is what France really started, a so-called bonus-malus system. The bonus is given to the EVs, and then the malus is at least start taxing the most polluting cars and spend that money to incentivize EVs. And more countries are doing that. Sweden started 2018. They're now number 3 in Europe when it comes to EV uptake. New Zealand just started this. They had no policies at all. They were inspired by Norway, and a lot of political debates, especially about their utes or pickup trucks that are not electric yet, but they got it through. So it's more and more political will to start incentivizing, and also not just incentivizing, but also taxing the cars we don't want anymore. And that's what I mean. We can't, I mean, the dealers which you're talking about, forget about the dealers. I don't think the dealers or the importers in Norway were very eager at the beginning either. But who cares? When the policies came, the demand started, and they just had to deal with it, and they dealt with it. And today, if you're the importers that don't have EVs are devastated. Their market is gone, like Toyota, for example, and big problems in Norway with Toyota at the moment.
Yeah.
So just get the policies there, and that's something that politicians have to do. At least start taxing, and I'm again talking about sales. At least tax the most polluting cars, because if people really want to buy these cars instead of another car, well, then you have to pay for it, because we're in a climate crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably most people on the call here today are in agreement with that, that you know, we have to take those policy measures that accelerate this. Mike, I wanted to come in because I know what you think about a lot is what, you know, not the vehicles and the vehicle sales, but how we keep those vehicles on the road and charging infrastructure, etc. How you mentioned about the importance of the home systems in your opening remarks, but tell me a little bit about the build out and what role governments can play in that build out, what role policy plays in ensuring we get the right build out of charging systems.
Well, you know, I think what's happened, and outside of Norway, which is clearly an outlier, but what's happened in many governments is there's been a big focus from an infrastructure point of view, really on the public charging. So what's available by public and can be in a highway, what we call in transit. You see a lot of companies trying to replicate the current gas station model. And again, this infrastructure is necessary. It's necessary to cover long distance travel. It's necessary to cover emergencies. It's necessary to cover use cases where you actually do drive, you know, more than 1,500 kilometers on average per day. So that's fine. It's necessary. You need it to reduce range anxiety. But where the government's focused less is really on where the majority of the charging sessions are going to happen. And that's going to be at homes, and that's going to be at buildings. And if you look, and you take Europe, for example, 1/3 of drivers say that they will charge uniquely at home. 80% of drivers say that they will have access to a charger at home. Now, of course, there's a big difference between single family, multifamily, so you have that dynamic. But nonetheless, it means that the majority, or let's say 90% of the actual charging sessions themselves are going to happen inside of homes or inside of buildings. And you need to put infrastructure in there. That means the charger, that means AC, DC protection, as well as energy management. Because as soon as you connect a charger to your home, you're going to have an immediate material impact. That becomes the largest appliance in your home. You know, maybe before it was your oven at a few kilowatts. Now you're coming in a car, you know, asking for 11 kilowatts or even more, when maybe the service to your house is below that. So there's a real big play instantly in home. And then in buildings, it's the same case, but it's just at scale. And today, nobody really talks about it because I can connect, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 chargers to my building, and I'm really happy. I take a picture and put it on social media, and that's great. And it's not a problem because buildings have a bit of extra capacity built in. So as we get to scale and you start connecting 100, 500, 1,000, you know, vehicles to a building load, well, you're going to have a material impact, and you better have an integration to your building management system. You better have a load management. So the point here is that from the government and public point of view, the investment, yes, is necessary to enable those long range, to reduce range anxiety, but it's really critical in homes and buildings that we build out that infrastructure now, not only in new construction, which we already start to see regulation that's doing a great job, but I think from the incentive point of view, on the brownfield, what we call the existing buildings, existing homes, that's where governments, I think, can do a lot more to help those homeowners and those businesses to build out that infrastructure.
I mean, that's a key point, and one which will, I'm sure, come up in a couple of weeks' time, because it's the same issue on that on the electric usage in your house around heat pumps. And if you're you know, well inclined in doing the right thing and want to have a charger and a heat pump, and many of the connections, certainly where I live, many of the connections are not up for that kind of electricity usage. So as you say, you know, building that out now before people get to the point where they realize they can't actually do the right thing. Again, you know, there are all these sort of bumps in the road. But just before,
and Diana, just to your point here, I mean, if you expand the conversation at home, besides just the electric vehicle, and you go to the heat pump and et cetera, then you know, there's a study done by Rewiring America. So here, this is focusing on the US, which says that there's going to be, you know, soon roughly 1 billion devices that are going to be electrified that aren't electrified today. And that means that on average in the US, you need to upgrade the service of homes of 500,000 homes per day these numbers are just mind-boggling, right? If we're gonna manage the energy needs of these new devices, heat pumps, EVs, and everything else that's electrifying, then there's a massive infrastructure upgrade to be done, especially at home.
I think, Ralph, we need to ask you as part of your say-do index to track some of these really granular things around, how many homes actually have the capabilities of doing this. I think that'd be really interesting whether we're doing those upgrades. But before we Mike, just one question on that is this whole issue of vehicle to grid and home storage, and how that will help with the kind of problems that you've been talking about if we think of our home as a more integrated system, and what is the real potential of using vehicles as part of a kind of grid balancing system to make that more effective overall?
Well, this is a very, there's a lot of discussion on this topic, and there has been for years, and there's many opinions, but I think, there's going to be some specific use cases where you have large amounts of storage and a limited number of vehicles where you can actually do something probably at grid level. But I think the majority of that is going to happen really at the home level and at the building level, which means how do I optimize between my electric vehicle battery, my home storage unit, the on-site storage, on-site generation I have on my rooftop with my load center. How do I manage, and the load coming from the utility, how do I manage all of this? And here you need a layer of software to coordinate all of those hardware choices. And the same, is at buildings, but just at scale. And I think this is really one of the answers. It's going to be about energy management, about avoiding time of use tariffs, about avoiding demand surcharge, about leveraging the power when you have it, when it's cheaper. And a lot of this coordination can frankly be done at the level of the home and also at the level of the building. So there is going to be, of course, some coordination at the grid level, but there's a huge job that we can do already today, demand side, at home and at buildings, just by connecting everything, just by linking and adding on-site storage, connecting to the utility, connecting to the cars. And with that data exchange, you can really optimize already and be efficient with what we have versus needing even to produce more. And
presumably a lot of people have mentioned, home solar generation. But I want to go back to Christina now and ask about the vehicles. Someone posed the question of what happens to, what's the cycle of vehicles? What happens to all these internal combustion engine vehicles that are being kind of pushed through the system? Do we have an effective way of dealing with the environmental, the sort of life cycle environmental consequences of vehicles? I think is the bigger question. And obviously there are questions around the environmental consequences of mining for battery metals, etc., and how much effort we're putting into recycling in that space. Do you have any thoughts around how best to optimize?
Yeah, well, on Monday I took part in the opening of Europe's biggest recycling factory for EV batteries here in Norway. So that was really cool with two ministers. This factory will recycle EV batteries from all over Europe. It's owned by the Norwegian company Hydro and the Swedish battery factory Northvolt. So their plan is to recycle more or less 95% of the battery. So I think that we have to focus on circular economy when it comes to cars and when it comes to EVs. When it comes to all the ICE cars that are already on the road, well, they are there. And this is the reason why we can't wait, in my opinion, until 2035 before we stop selling petrol and diesel engine cars. We have to do that sooner. And I'm not necessarily, Ralph, you were talking about it a little bit earlier, I'm not necessarily talking about a ban. Norway has not decided on a ban, actually. It's all parties in parliament has decided on a goal. And then it's up to the politicians to make sure they reach that goal. And for us as a pressure group, we lobby, obviously, and we represent more than 100,000 EV drivers in Norway to make sure they also do what they have to do to make that happen, keep the incentives in place for long enough. And I think one of the reasons why I'm not necessarily that fond of talking about banning ICE cars at this moment, maybe at a later moment, is that you get a lot of negative focus because in the public debate, and especially in a country where you haven't gotten that far in the development. In Norway, maybe we can start that discussion soon because EVs have become very popular and people, understand it, but it takes a bit of time. But if the politicians just start talking about banning, it's just going to piss people off, at least quite a few. So I think rather do what is needed to make it happen. But the ICE cars that are there, and they will be there until they die. and you can, of course, try to retrofit, and there's some focus on that. But we all have to just understand that we need to sell less cars, and the cars that we sell, they should be as circular as possible, and they should be able to run on renewable fuels. And I do not believe in waiting until we get 100% renewable electricity production in the world before we start rolling out those EVs. EVs make sense everywhere now, even in Poland, in Europe, which is the most coal-intensive country. It makes sense now. But at the same time as rolling out these EVs, we need to get to 100% renewable electricity production as well. And that is also a big job that has to happen quickly. Big debates in Norway about wind power, like in many other countries, I think. We need more solar. And yeah, we need to speed this up. But there are a lot of good signs, a lot of good things happening. It is moving along. And I think that it's people pretty quickly, they join this movement. And I think that's what's good about EVs, is that often when we talk about climate change, it's often a pointed finger. You should stop doing that. You shouldn't fly. You shouldn't, you should eat less meat and all of these things, which you should. but with EVs, it's often something that people, it's fun. It's fun.
That's the advantage, it's fun.
And I think that's important. I think that's important that people actually, it's something fun. And we see also that people who gets an EV, they say they never want to go back. They never want to go back to an ICE car. And they also become more interested in solar. They become more interested in other technologies that actually is energy effective. So it's a win-win. But that said, in cities, we need to focus on public transport, on biking, on walking, of course, but the cars that is actually sold, those have to be zero emission.
Mike, do you want to come in at all on that interplay between renewable energy and EV rollout?
There we go. Christina is absolutely right. When you look at the journey, people typically start from electric vehicles and then go into solar. And here I'm talking on average. So it's really, the electrification of home and going on this journey of becoming not only a consumer, but also a producer really starts from the EV. So it's really important that we deploy EVs fast. And as these EV drivers become more educated, more knowledgeable about what's a kilowatt, how much energy am I consuming, how do I manage my energy at home, how much does it cost? A lot of people today don't really know or care, but they start to care when they start to use. So that's when people become more educated, more knowledgeable. And I think there's a big gap to fill there in terms of knowledge and education on what we can do. What does it really mean to put, solar on my roof? And, I know, people who pay zero, right, for their electricity bills each year. In fact, they get rebates back from utilities because they generate more than they use. So there's a big play here. Again, it requires, first of all, an EV car, but it requires also rooftop solar, some solar inverters. So there's a lot of hardware there, but more importantly is the software layer and the orchestration cost. But here it's possible with digital, with algorithm, we can optimize between when I charge my car, when I don't, compared to the utility tariff. And you see a lot of bricks that exist today out on the market in terms of, I can optimize my utility or I can optimize my solar. And what we really need now is one layer that's optimizing all of those bricks and orchestrating at home to make it efficient. And this is coming. I mean, this is coming. It's not really too far away.
What I was saying is it's great to hear that we are making progress in that space, in that integration. The other area that we're making progress in is increasing the type of vehicles that are being electrified. So there was a big splash, obviously, around the Ford electric pickup truck, the F-150, which is coming. You can't apparently order one anymore because they've you know, the order books are closed. But how this question of providing the consumer with more choice, and particularly a country like Canada, you know, it's a fairly rugged country. In parts of the country, you know, people say, oh, I can't use an EV because it's not suitable to my environment. But we do seem to be able to move up the value chain there. How, you know, question is, can we expect the full suite of vehicles to be electrified going forward? And how, you know, how high up the value chain do we get in terms of heavy vehicles? We move into, you know, vans, work trucks, you know, electric transport for goods, etc. What are you seeing in Norway, which is also a snowy country and a rugged country? Is that excuse made anymore?
Well, a little bit, but it's fading away. We closely look at sales numbers all over Norway. Of course, it's really started in the biggest cities, but now the EV sales are high in all counties. Even our northernmost county, Finnmark. Finnmark is very remote. It's the very northernmost county of Norway. It's the size of Denmark. Only 75,000 people live there. Long distances. Picture snow and reindeers. That's Finnmark. I'm not joking. Finnmark had a market share Q1 of 50%, 51%. Of course, they don't sell that many cars there, but still 51%. And it really started after getting fast chargers up there, because up until 2019 they didn't have a single fast charging station. But with some public support, most of the fast chargers in Norway are built commercially now. It's commercially interesting. We have more than 4,000 fast or super fast chargers. But in Finnmark, there was some public support because there were no commercial interest in building there. And as soon as that network got up, sales really started growing, because people in Finnmark, they were also saying, why shouldn't we be able to buy EVs as well? So it changes quickly. So all those sort of more remote locations are now really following suit and have, in some examples, they have higher EV sales now than Oslo, because now the cars that are sold have good range. They have, you can add a tow bar, and it has a bit more of a size and compared to what was common a few years back. So the all of the country is taking part in this change at the moment. But of course, the share on the road is a bit different. As I said, Oslo, more or less 1/3 of the passenger cars are now already full electric because they started earlier. But it's really moving ahead. When it comes to other vehicles, Norway is doing quite a lot when it comes to the maritime sector. We already have lots, about, I think, close to 60 fully electric car ferries now. So in the maritime industry, it's really, really moving ahead. Oslo, soon all the ferries in Oslo will be electric ferries. Buses in the cities, it makes economic sense already. So it's more and more electric buses. We have a new national law from this year saying that all public procurants have to be, if they buy cars, a municipality or any public office buy a car, it has to be zero emission from this year, from 1st of January this year. Some exceptions like ambulances and so on. Was a lot of discussion about taxis in the northern western part of Norway, because they are, yeah, some can that work here? But yes, it works. When it comes to heavy transport, we are just seeing the beginning of that. It's very interesting, but big manufacturers like Scania, for example, they have decided they really gonna go for electric. In Europe, we have a rule that was decided, I think it was the 70s or something, that a truck driver has to have a break every 4 hours. Very good rule for electric heavy transport, because then you can charge. So perfectly possible to electrify heavy transport as well. There's a bit of a challenge there for Mike and everyone building chargers then, because we're talking megawatt chargers, and we need to plan for that. So there are definitely difficulties. I haven't said that much about charging. Charging is probably one of the biggest challenges going forward, but it is working in Norway. When it comes to charging in apartment buildings, which Mike was talking about, in my apartment building where I'm sitting right now, there are a few years back, I think maybe 5 years back, they put up around 20 or 30 chargers. I told them, this is a dumb idea, you should add them everywhere. They didn't listen to me. And then 1 year ago, they had to pull all those 30 away, and they put up on all 200 parking spaces, because it has to be a smart system where you share the electricity that is available, smart charging system. So it's just about understanding how fast this happens. And it will happen, I think, faster in the rest of Europe, in Canada, than it has in Norway, because you're helped with a lot better technology, better cars, a lot more has happened charging wise. So this is going really, it's the beginning of an S curve. And for companies sitting here listening, it's just about understanding that, because this also creates immense economic opportunities. And I saw some comments in the chat here about Norway and oil. Yes, we are very dependent, like Canada, on oil. We have a large proportion of people working in the oil industry in Norway. But the government has really focusing on the fact that we cannot live off oil forever. And if we think that, then we're going to be doomed because our economy is very dependent on it. So we need to start finding new things to, create wealth. And one of those things that the government now is focusing on is, for example, the battery industry. Several battery factories now being planned in Norway, just one example. So there are new opportunities also emerging with a new world with electric transport and also, batteries as storage and so on. And I think that's also important to focus on. It's not just negative when it comes to jobs vanishing in Europe, when it comes to OEMs and so on. It's also great opportunities here.
I should just remain off mute. I'm going to go to the others again, but I just very, very quickly, someone asked about road pricing and congestion charging. Is that something that has been used in Norway? In London, for example, it preferences electric vehicles on road pricing. Is that another tool that's been used?
Yeah, there are quite a few local incentives as well, and they have been very important. One of them is tolls. We have lots of toll roads. Both main highways are financed with tolls, and also a lot of the cities have tolls around. You can call it congestion pricing, but it's just also financing road construction. So EVs have been exempt. They have been zero tolls for many years. But a few years back, they pulled that back, and now it's a rebate. But a rebate has been very important because it's very visible for people. The fact that, going past a toll every day, you think about that cost. So it's definitely been an incentive that has been working.
And Ralph, you made the point about public transport, and this is about decarbonizing. This isn't just about EVs, this session. This is about decarbonizing transport. And we know that there's been problems with people going back to transit post-pandemic. Fewer people are commuting anyway. But what are your thoughts on ways that we can make transit more appealing to populations in Canada specifically, where it's not as heavily used as in European cities, for example?
Well, even in my small town here in Southern Ontario, it's 20,000 people. Plans are proceeding to implement a door-to-door public transit service. And what's making, this has been tried for decades. I think Seattle and Washington State in the US tried it in the early 1990s, I recall. But what's making the difference now is the advances that have been made in the technology that optimizes the routes of the medium-sized vehicles that can provide this kind of service. so that the level of convenience can be maximized and the waiting time can be minimized, and it can start to approach, it becomes an attractive alternative for the traveler. And the costs are brought down by the efficiencies that these new software applications are bringing to it, along with the electric vehicle component. So I could see a future for public transit. I mean, the fixed link mainline routes will always be feasible in cities where there are a lot of people moving. But for public transit to succeed in the suburbs with suburb to suburb travel, where it has basically failed, it's going to have to change its model, which really dates back to the 1950s, you know, where everybody went downtown for the day and worked and then came home. The women weren't in the workforce. I mean, it was a different world. So I'm optimistic about transit, but I do think it needs to evolve with the times and with the technologies that are available to it. And then I think there are some very exciting prospects on the horizon for a new type of public transit that is more granular and will be more competitive with the private automobile than it has been up until now. This is a North American perspective you're hearing, where our transit modal shares have never got, with a few cities exceptions, have never really got into the above 20-25% range like is commonly seen in Europe. Also, the transit modal shares are very low in the middle income countries. A lot of people take transit, but as a percent of travel, it's not very high. And so the opportunity there to get to leapfrog, if you like, into a more advanced high-tech version of public transit, I think suggests itself.
That's great. I mean, we clearly need everything. This has been a really great discussion, and I'm going to close out now. But I wanted to come to Mike. Just again, the other speakers have just given us a really upbeat vision of great opportunities, economic opportunities in this space, good opportunities for rethinking public transport. What lying in this space, kind of behind what the consumer sees on the transit sector. What are your thoughts about direction of travel and how overall you can help accelerate this journey going forward?
Well, Diana, I mean, we like to think of the iceberg analogy. When you look at the electrification of transport, the visible part is mainly the charger and the user interface, which either can be embedded in the charger or it's more and more going to be an application on your phone. And this is the part that everyone sees. And what everybody doesn't see below is all of the integration to the to Christina's apartment building, for example, or into the grid when you're charging on the highway. And there is a lot of work behind that, and it's very complicated. But here's the good news, and this is why I'm upbeat, is that all of those technologies exist today. We have the technology today, whether it's on hardware, whether it's on software, whether it's on integrations, the technology exists today. So I'm very upbeat because I know that once the EV car is sold, the technology already exists to actually charge it, and exists to charge it at home, and also at what do you call it, at workplace or at destination like a hotel, etc. So we have the technology. It's just a matter of doing it. So I'm super optimistic. There's not a lot of work to do on the technology side to make it happen.
I think that's fantastic to hear, because as I say, in so many of these sectors, we're relying on technologies that kind of haven't been built yet, that we don't know what's going to happen. But here it's a question of rollout, getting it right, getting the policies right. I think that's been a clear message of this session, is that we need to get the policies right, that governments have this in their hands, or have the capacity to make really big shifts in this, and also getting the hopefully getting our supply chains back in some kind of normal shape, that we can do this more effectively. Last word from you, Ralph and Christina. I'll go to Ralph first, if there's anything you want to say. I know you're going to share your slides.
We're going to re-record my presentation with the slides synchronized and put it up on the website. It'll take us a day or so for those of you who are interested in seeing a second take of that. I would just add, echo Mike's comments that, when I started out in this field, I did my first, what today would be called low carbon scenario analysis in 1981. We didn't have the prospect of cheap carbon-free electricity, solar and wind. Electric vehicles were something that, were not really an option on the scale that they've developed. The heat pump was, we had refrigerators, but the idea of using heat pump technology to apply electricity to space heating, we were trying to minimize the application of electricity to everything back in those days. So we have been, there are some real gifts that have been handed to us, or that we've worked to create, if you like, that if we didn't have them, and the electric vehicle is one of them, would make the climate change challenge so much more daunting than it is. And it's daunting enough. But for goodness sake, we've got the electric vehicle, we have the technology. It's something that we can do in the 2020s. It doesn't have to wait for another 10 years of technological development and demonstration like some of the options do. So let's get on with the electric vehicles. Let's get on with the decarbonization of the grids, and let's get on with the, with the penetration of heat pumps into the low temperature heat sector, because these are all ready to go.
Thank you, Ralph. Christina, send us on our way.
I'll just follow up on that shortly, that if everyone listening in today, if you ever buy a new car, I'm not talking secondhand, but if you buy a new car, promise me you'd buy an electric one. Wait another 2 years if that's necessary, but please, that's something that everyone can do and think about.
I'm lucky enough to be the driver of an electric car already, so I now have to get my home storage sorted out, and my integration. Mike, I will be looking to you for help with that. Listen, thanks for a great conversation today. I really do feel like there's a lot of practical things that have come out of this, and there's a clear route ahead. So thank you for joining us. To all our panelists, thank you for the people who've been having a very active discussion in the chat, which I've been trying to follow as we go along, but there's some really great points that have been made that I haven't been able to raise. I'm sorry for that. I hope you're going to join us in a couple of weeks' time. We're going to be talking about buildings, which relates to this question of transportation. And I would say is, if anything, well, it's similar in that we know what the solutions are, but perhaps harder to put them in place, it turns out. But let's get deeply into that in 2 weeks' time. Please join us then, and thanks for being here today.